He thought it would be funny to humiliate her in front of a packed room, but within minutes, he would wish he had never handed her the microphone. The ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel shimmered under crystal chandeliers, each one casting warm golden light across marble floors that echoed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of wealthy conversation. It was the kind of place where reputations were built or destroyed in a single evening, and tonight, all eyes were on Victor Langford. The charismatic host known across the country for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue, a man who could turn any moment into entertainment, no matter the cost. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, his polished shoes reflecting the stage lights as he paced with effortless confidence, feeding off the energy of the crowd like a performer who had never known failure, and the audience loved him for it. They expected his jokes, his teasing, his unpredictable stunts, but what they didn't realize was that Victor had already chosen his next target long before the spotlight shifted. Tucked quietly along the far edge of the room, near a service entrance partially hidden behind velvet curtains, stood Emily Carter, dressed in a simple black uniform, her hair tied back neatly, her posture calm and unassuming. She moved quietly between tables earlier that evening, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, doing everything she could to remain invisible in a room that celebrated attention. Most people never noticed her, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Her eyes stayed lowered, her steps measured, blending into the rhythm of the staff, but Victor noticed her, not because she stood out, but because she didn't, and to him, that made her the perfect choice, the perfect contrast, the perfect setup. His smile widened slightly as he leaned into the microphone, his voice cutting through the room with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pausing just long enough to let anticipation build, "we've had incredible performances tonight, haven't we?" A ripple of applause followed, exactly as expected, but I think it's time we try something a little more spontaneous. A few chuckles spread across the crowd. They knew what was coming, they always did. Victor's gaze drifted deliberately across the room before landing on Emily, still standing quietly by the curtain, unaware that every second was pulling her closer to the center of attention. "You there," he called, pointing directly at her, his tone light but commanding. "Yes, you, don't be shy." The room turned in unison, dozens of heads pivoting toward the corner, eyes scanning until they found her, and just like that, invisibility shattered. Emily froze for half a second, the sudden weight of attention pressing against her, but she didn't step forward. "Not yet." Victor chuckled softly, as if amused by her hesitation. "Come on," he added, his voice playful, but edged with expectation. "We could use a little fresh talent tonight." Laughter rippled again, louder this time, encouraged by his tone, by the implication, by the unspoken understanding that this was meant to entertain, not uplift. A nearby staff member gently nudged Emily forward, unsure how else to respond, and slowly, almost reluctantly, she stepped into the light. Her simple uniform now stark against the polished elegance of the stage. The contrast was immediate, intentional, and the crowd felt it. Some smiled, some whispered, some lifted their phones, ready to capture what they assumed would be an awkward, forgettable moment. Victor stepped closer, lowering the microphone slightly as he looked her up and down with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone casual, almost kind, but the room sensed the setup. "Emily," she answered softly, her voice barely carrying beyond the first row. "Emily," Victor repeated, drawing out the syllables, as if testing them. "Tell me, Emily, do you sing?" A pause, brief but heavy, the kind that stretched longer than it should. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides, but before she could respond, Victor raised a hand, cutting through the silence. "You know what, it doesn't matter," he said with a grin, turning back to the audience. "Tonight, everyone sings." Laughter erupted, louder now, more confident, the energy shifting into something sharper, something expectant. Victor turned back to her, extending the microphone into her space, not aggressively, but with undeniable pressure. "Go ahead," he said, his voice dropping just enough to sound like encouragement. "Surprise us," and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air, the lights, the whispers, the quiet judgment woven into every glance. Emily stood there, still, her eyes lifting slowly toward the crowd for the first time, taking in the faces, the anticipation, the assumption, and then, almost imperceptibly, her breathing steadied, the noise around her beginning to fade, as if the entire room had been pulled back by something unseen. Victor leaned slightly closer, ready to deliver his next line, ready to steer the moment, ready to claim control once again, but what he didn't realize, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that the moment he placed that microphone in her hands, the night no longer belonged to him. Emily's fingers wrapped around the microphone, and for a brief second, the weight of it felt heavier than it should have been, as if it carried every expectation in the room, every quiet judgment, every assumption already made about her before she had even spoken a word. The crowd leaned in slightly, some smiling with anticipation, others already amused, waiting for the inevitable awkward note, the missed pitch, the moment they could laugh and move on. Victor stepped back half a pace, giving her space but never truly releasing control, his expression relaxed, confident, certain that this would unfold exactly as he had planned. "Take your time," he added, his tone smooth, almost reassuring, but there was an edge beneath it, a subtle pressure that made it clear this was not an invitation, it was a performance she had already been cast in. Emily glanced down for a moment, her grip tightening just slightly before loosening again, her shoulders rising with a slow breath. And then something shifted, not outwardly at first, not in a way the audience could immediately see, but internally, like a switch being flipped in complete silence. The noise of the room, the clinking glasses, the scattered laughter, the low hum of conversation, all of it began to fade, not because it stopped, but because it no longer reached her. Her world narrowed to the small circle of light around her, the smooth metal of the microphone in her hand, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Victor tilted his head slightly, watching, waiting for hesitation to stretch into discomfort, for discomfort to turn into embarrassment. It was a pattern he had seen countless times before, and it never failed to entertain, but Emily did not look at him, not anymore. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the far end of the room, not focusing on any single person, but looking beyond them, as if the space itself had opened into something larger, something only she could see. A faint memory brushed across her mind, a stage much smaller than this one, a dimly lit room with a worn piano, the echo of a voice guiding her through each note, patient, steady, unwavering. Years ago, before life had required quieter choices, before the world had taught her to step back instead of forward, the memory did not linger, it did not distract her, it anchored her. And when she finally moved, it was with a calm that did not match the expectation surrounding her. She lifted the microphone just slightly closer, her posture straightening in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Victor's smile flickered for the briefest moment, not disappearing, but adjusting, as if something in her stillness did not align with the script he had written in his mind. The band members off to the side exchanged quick glances, uncertain whether they were supposed to accompany her or wait. No one had been given instructions for this, because no one expected it to matter. A soft murmur moved through the audience, a mix of impatience and curiosity. Someone near the back let out a quiet laugh. Another voice whispered, "This is going to be painful," but Emily did not react. She did not rush, she did not fill the silence with nervous words or apologies. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle, to stretch just long enough that the laughter began to lose its rhythm, that the whispers started to thin, that even the smallest movements in the room felt slightly out of place. Victor shifted his weight, bringing the microphone in his own hand closer to his mouth, ready to interject, ready to steer the moment back into something predictable. But before he could speak, before he could reclaim the space, Emily inhaled, slow and controlled, and then she began. The first note did not burst into the room, it arrived, clear and steady, as if it had always belonged there, cutting through the remaining noise with a precision that silenced the nearest tables instantly. It was not loud, not yet, but it was unmistakably right, the kind of tone that made people pause without knowing why. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, a glass hovered halfway to someone's lips, Victor's mouth remained slightly open, the words he had been about to say caught somewhere between thought and sound. Emily's voice carried forward, growing not in volume alone but in presence, filling the space in a way that did not demand attention but commanded it. The band members froze, one of them lowering his instrument slowly as he realized there was nothing he could add that would not diminish what was already unfolding. A second note followed, then a third, each one layered with a depth that no one in the room had prepared for. And just like that, the laughter that had once filled the ballroom disappeared completely, replaced by something heavier, something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to awe. And in that moment, as every eye in the room locked onto the woman they had overlooked just minutes before, the truth began to settle in, not all at once, but piece by piece, that this was no accident, no lucky moment, no hidden trick. This was something real, something practiced, something earned, and Victor Langford, standing just a few feet away, felt the first unmistakable crack in his certainty, because for the first time that night, he was no longer in control of what came next. The third note did not just fill the room, it transformed it, rising higher with a control so precise that it felt almost unreal, as if every vibration had been carefully placed, every breath measured to perfection, and suddenly the air itself seemed to tighten, not in discomfort, but in reverence. People were no longer watching out of curiosity, they were listening, truly listening. The kind of silence that cannot be forced, only earned, settled over the ballroom, thick and absolute. Emily stood completely still at the center of it, her simple uniform unchanged, her presence now impossible to ignore, and yet she did not perform for them, she did not seek their approval, her eyes remained steady, focused somewhere beyond the chandeliers, beyond the polished tables, as if she had stepped into a world that existed long before this moment and would remain long after it. Victor Langford felt it before he understood it, the shift, subtle at first, like the ground beneath him no longer responding the way it always had. His confidence, once effortless, now paused, searching for footing that was no longer there. He glanced toward the audience, expecting to find a reaction he could work with, a laugh, a whisper, anything that would return control to him, but instead he saw something else entirely: wide eyes, parted lips, stillness, and then something that unsettled him more than anything else: recognition, not from everyone, not yet, but from enough people to matter. In the front row, a man in a dark gray suit leaned forward, his brows drawn together in disbelief. Beside him, a woman slowly lowered her phone, her expression shifting from amusement to something sharper, more focused, as if a memory had just resurfaced. The band members exchanged another look, one of them mouthing a silent question, but no one dared interrupt, because it was clear now that interruption would feel wrong, almost disrespectful. Emily's voice moved into the next phrase, stronger now, fuller, the kind of sound that did not just reach the ears but settled somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to ignore. Each note carried weight, not heavy, but undeniable. The kind of weight that comes from years of discipline, from hours unseen, from choices made quietly without an audience, and the room responded in kind, not with applause, not yet, but with stillness so complete that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. Victor's hand tightened slightly around his own microphone, a gesture so small it went unnoticed by most, but it betrayed the shift happening inside him. This was not how the moment was supposed to unfold. He had orchestrated countless scenes like this before, each one predictable, each one ending with him firmly in control, but this was different. This was slipping beyond him, and he could feel it. The audience was no longer looking to him for direction, their attention had shifted entirely, pulled towards something he had not created and could not command. Emily reached a higher note, not strained, not forced, but effortless, the kind of control that comes only from mastery, and it hung in the air for a fraction longer than expected, just enough to make time feel slower, just enough to make every person in the room aware that they were witnessing something rare, something they had not anticipated. And then it resolved, smooth, precise, complete. A quiet exhale moved through the audience, almost collective, as if they had all been holding their breath without realizing it. Victor opened his mouth again, instinctively trying to reclaim the moment, to insert a comment, a joke, anything to remind the room that he was still the one in charge, but the words did not come, not because he had nothing to say, but because anything he said now would feel smaller than what had just happened. And somewhere behind him, near the edge of the stage, a staff member whispered something to another, too soft to be heard clearly, but enough to signal that the shift was no longer just emotional, it was tangible, real, and growing. Emily continued, her voice weaving through the silence with increasing confidence. Not louder, but deeper, more certain, and the transformation in the room became undeniable. This was no longer a moment of entertainment, it was something else entirely, something that demanded respect without asking for it. And as the final phrase of her verse approached, the energy in the ballroom tightened once more, not with tension, but with anticipation, because now, everyone understood that this was not the end of the surprise, it was only the beginning. And Victor Langford, standing just a few feet away, realized with a clarity that cut through his usual composure that the story unfolding in front of him was no longer his to control, and whatever came next would define far more than just the night. The final note of her phrase lingered in the air just long enough to feel eternal, then dissolved into a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate, as if the entire ballroom had agreed, without words, not to break what had just been created. No applause came at first, no movement, just stillness, the kind that follows something undeniable, something that leaves no room for doubt. Emily lowered the microphone slightly, not as a signal that she was finished, but as if she understood the weight of the moment and refused to rush it. Her expression remained calm, unchanged, untouched by the shift that had overtaken the room, while across from her, Victor Langford stood frozen in a way he had never experienced before, his usual instinct to fill silence with humor, to redirect attention, to reclaim control, all of it stalled, caught somewhere behind the realization that anything he said now would expose the very thing he had spent years avoiding, irrelevance. A single clap broke through the silence, sharp and clear, coming from the front row. It was the man in the dark gray suit, his expression no longer confused, but certain. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on Emily with a recognition that carried weight. Then another clap followed, and another, until the room began to awaken, applause spreading not like a reaction, but like a realization. People rose to their feet one by one, not out of obligation, but because something inside them demanded it. The sound grew, filling the ballroom, echoing off the marble floors and glass walls. And yet even in the rising applause, there was a different energy, not the loud, careless excitement from earlier, but something deeper, more respectful, more aware. Victor blinked, once, then again, as if trying to reorient himself in a scene that no longer followed his direction. He forced a smile, thin at first, then wider, attempting to merge himself back into the moment. He lifted his microphone, finally finding his voice. Well, he began, his tone slightly tighter than before. I think we can all agree, that was unexpected. A few scattered laughs responded. But they were softer now, hesitant, no longer fueled by him, no longer fully his. He stepped closer to Emily, careful, measured, as if approaching something fragile. You never mentioned you could sing like that, he added, attempting lightness, but the question carried something else beneath it, something closer to uncertainty. Emily turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes steady, not challenging, not defensive, simply present. You did not ask, she replied quietly, her voice no longer amplified, yet somehow still heard. A subtle shift passed through the nearest listeners, a few exchanged glances, the simplicity of her answer landing heavier than any dramatic response could have. Victor let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, but it lacked its usual confidence. Fair enough, he said, nodding, though his gaze flickered briefly toward the audience again, searching, measuring, calculating. But the room had already moved on from him, their attention returned to Emily, not with curiosity now, but with respect. And then, from somewhere near the stage, a voice called out, Emily Carter. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had lowered her phone, now standing, her expression filled with something close to disbelief. You sang at the Lincoln Hall benefit 3 years ago, did you not? The question cut through the room with a different kind of silence, sharper, more focused. Heads turned again, not toward Victor this time, but toward Emily, waiting, watching. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the stage, Emily hesitated, not out of fear, but out of consideration, as if deciding whether the past mattered here. In this moment, under these lights, she held the microphone loosely, her fingers relaxed, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The reaction was immediate. A wave of recognition spreading faster than before. Whispers replaced the applause, but these whispers carried a different tone, names, events, fragments of memory piecing themselves together. That was her, someone murmured, the one who. Another voice trailed off, not needing to finish, because the understanding had already taken hold. Victor's expression shifted again, the pieces aligning too quickly for comfort. The confidence he had relied on now replaced with something unfamiliar, something he could not easily disguise. He stepped back half a pace, the movement subtle, but symbolic, as if the stage itself had begun to belong to someone else. And Emily, still standing in the same simple uniform, still holding the same microphone, had become something entirely different in the eyes of everyone watching, not because she demanded it, not because she revealed it loudly, but because she did not need to. And in that moment, as the applause slowly returned, stronger and more certain than before. Victor Langford understood something he had never truly considered, that control, once lost in the presence of something genuine, is almost impossible to take back, and the room, once guided by his voice, now waited for hers. The applause did not fade this time, it deepened, spreading across the ballroom with a kind of certainty that no longer needed permission. People were no longer reacting out of surprise, they were responding to truth. And Emily Carter stood in the center of it all with the same quiet composure she had carried from the very beginning, as if nothing about her had changed, even though everything around her had. Victor Langford remained just behind her, his presence now reduced to something secondary, almost incidental, the man who once commanded the room now watching it slip, piece by piece, into someone else's gravity. He cleared his throat softly, lifting his microphone again, not to reclaim control, but to rejoin the moment in whatever way he still could. "Emily," he said. This time without performance, without the practiced charm, just a name spoken plainly. The room quieted again, not because he demanded it, but because they were waiting to hear what came next. "I think everyone here would like to know, why," he continued, his voice steadier now, but stripped of its earlier confidence, "why someone with your voice would be standing behind a service door instead of on this stage." The question hung in the air, not mocking, not accusing, but genuine in a way that surprised even him. Emily did not answer immediately. She lowered the microphone slightly, her gaze drifting across the room, not searching, not avoiding, simply observing, as if she saw something in each face that they themselves did not yet understand. The chandeliers still shimmered above, the polished glasses still reflected the light, but the energy had changed. The room was no longer about status, or appearance, or performance. It had become something quieter, more honest, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm strength as before. "Because not every voice needs a stage to exist," she said, her words measured, unhurried, and for a moment, no one moved, the simplicity of her answer settling deeper than any elaborate explanation could. Victor blinked, absorbing it, his grip on the microphone loosening just slightly, as if the need to hold on to it had faded. A few people nodded subtly in the audience, others exchanged glances, not confused, but thoughtful, as if something inside them had shifted, something small but permanent. Emily lifted the microphone again, not to continue the same song, but to offer something more. "May I finish?" she asked, not to Victor, but to the room itself, and the response was immediate, a wave of quiet agreement, of expectation, of respect. Victor stepped back without hesitation, this time not as a retreat, but as acknowledgement, a silent understanding that the stage no longer belonged to him. The band members straightened slightly, ready now, attentive in a way they had not been before. And as Emily began again, her voice carried even more than before, not just skill, not just control, but meaning, every note resonating through the space with a clarity that made everything else feel secondary. The audience listened differently now, not waiting for a mistake, not expecting a punchline, but absorbing each moment as it came. The performance was no longer a surprise, it was a revelation unfolding in real time. And when the final note arrived, it did not demand applause, it earned it. The room rose again, louder this time, stronger, a standing ovation that felt less like a reaction and more like a correction, as if something that had been out of balance had finally been set right. Victor watched, not with frustration, not with envy, but with a quiet realization settling in, the kind that does not arrive often, but once it does not leave. He stepped forward slowly, lowering his microphone completely this time, his voice no longer needed, his presence no longer the center. And as Emily stood there, still composed, still grounded, the applause surrounding her like a wave she never asked for but fully deserved, the truth of the night became undeniable, not announced, not declared, but understood by everyone in that room. That respect is not given by position, or by spotlight, or by the loudest voice in the room. It reveals itself, quietly, powerfully, in moments like this, and once it does, it cannot be taken away. The applause carried on longer than anyone expected, not because it needed to, but because no one wanted to be the first to stop, as if ending it too soon would somehow diminish what they had just witnessed. And in the center of it all, Emily Carter remained still, her expression calm, her breathing steady, her presence unchanged despite the wave of admiration surrounding her. She did not bow dramatically, she did not step forward to claim the moment, she simply stood, allowing it to exist without trying to control it, and that, more than anything, held the room in place. Victor Langford watched her with a quiet intensity, his usual instincts now replaced with something far less familiar, reflection, the kind that does not arrive with comfort but with clarity. He had spent years mastering the art of commanding attention, of shaping moments to his advantage, of turning people into stories he could control, but tonight, for the first time, he had become part of someone else's story, and not in the way he intended. The applause slowly softened, not abruptly, but naturally, like a wave returning to the shore, and as it did, a new kind of silence took its place, one that felt less like anticipation and more like understanding. People began to sit, but their eyes remained fixed on Emily, as if waiting for something more, not because they expected it, but because they hoped for it. Victor stepped forward again, this time without the microphone raised, his posture different, less performative, more grounded. He glanced at the audience briefly, then back at her. "You changed the entire room," he said, his voice no longer amplified, yet carrying clearly in the quiet space. The statement was simple, but it held weight, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. Emily met his gaze for a moment, her expression steady, not dismissive, not triumphant, just present. "No," she replied gently, "the room was always capable of changing." Her words settled over the audience with a quiet power, shifting the focus away from herself and back onto something shared, something collective. Victor absorbed that, his lips pressing together slightly as he considered it, then nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he had never needed to before. Across the room, conversations began to form again, but they were different now, quieter, more thoughtful. People spoke in lower tones, not out of restraint, but out of respect for the moment that still lingered in the air. A man near the back turned to his companion and said softly, "I almost laughed earlier," and the admission carried a weight of its own, not shame, but awareness, a recognition of how quickly judgment can form, and how easily it can be proven wrong. Near the stage, one of the musicians approached slightly, hesitating before speaking. "That was incredible," he said, his voice genuine, unpolished. Emily offered a small nod in return, acknowledging the compliment without absorbing it fully, as if she understood that the moment belonged to more than just her. Victor looked out over the room one more time, his usual instincts no longer pushing him to fill the space with words. Instead, he let the silence exist, let the shift remain intact, and for perhaps the first time in his career, he chose not to perform. The chandeliers above continued to cast their warm glow, the marble floor still reflected the movement of the crowd, but something invisible had changed, something that could not be measured or displayed, only felt. And as Emily stepped back slightly, returning the microphone to its stand with the same quiet care she had carried from the beginning, it became clear that she was not stepping away from the moment. She was simply releasing it, allowing it to settle where it belonged, not in applause, not in recognition, but in memory. Victor watched her as she moved toward the edge of the stage, toward the same place where she had once stood unnoticed, but now every step was followed, not physically, but in attention, in respect. And as she reached the shadows near the curtain, blending once again into the background she had never truly left, the realization settled fully across the room, that greatness does not always arrive with announcement, it does not demand to be seen, it reveals itself when the moment calls for it, and when it does, it leaves something behind that cannot be ignored. Victor remained where he was, his microphone lowered, his voice quiet, and though the event would continue, though the night would move forward as all nights do, there was an unspoken understanding shared among everyone present, that what they had just witnessed would stay with them far longer than any performance they had planned. And in that lingering silence, filled not with emptiness but with meaning, the room seemed to hold on to one simple truth, that respect, once awakened, does not return to where it came from, it moves forward, reshaping everything it touches. The music had stopped, the applause had faded, and yet something in the room refused to return to what it had been before. Conversations resumed but carried a different weight, softer, slower, as if every word now passed through a layer of reflection. And near the edge of the ballroom, just beyond the velvet curtain where shadows gently swallowed the light, Emily Carter stood once more in the place she had started, unnoticed by position, but no longer unseen. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, as if the storm of attention had passed through her without leaving a mark. But across the room, attention still lingered, glances drawn toward her not by spectacle, but by something quieter, something earned. Victor Langford remained on the stage for a moment longer than necessary, the microphone still in his hand though he had no intention of using it, his gaze drifting toward the spot where Emily had stepped away, his mind replaying the moment not as a performance, but as a realization. He had spent years believing control was the foundation of influence, that shaping perception was the same as shaping truth, but tonight had exposed something different, something far less predictable, and far more powerful. He finally stepped down from the stage, not with his usual confidence, but with a measured calm, moving through the crowd as people instinctively made space for him, yet their attention did not follow as it once would have. Instead, it remained divided, shifting between him and the quiet figure near the curtain, a subtle but undeniable change. As he approached her, he slowed slightly, as if aware that this moment required something different than the persona he had built, something more honest. He stopped a few feet away, not too close, not imposing, simply present. "Emily," he said again, his voice low, steady, no longer performing for an audience. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with the same calm clarity that had unsettled him before. "Yes," she replied, and the simplicity of it left no room for interpretation, no space for control. Victor hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the moment. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, the words measured, deliberate, not loud enough to draw attention, but not hidden either. Emily did not respond immediately, her eyes remained on him, steady, attentive, allowing the weight of his words to settle before answering. "You do not owe me anything," she said softly, and again, her response shifted the balance, not rejecting the apology, but reframing it. Victor let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, only understanding. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I owe it to myself to say it." The admission lingered between them, simple, unguarded, and for the first time that night, there was no audience to shape it, no expectation to meet, just two people standing in a space that had been transformed by something neither of them had fully anticipated. Around them, the event continued. Waitstaff moved between tables, glasses were refilled, soft music resumed from the band, but even those small details carried a different rhythm now, more aware, more grounded. A few guests approached cautiously, offering quiet compliments, nods of respect, not overwhelming, not intrusive, but sincere. Emily acknowledged each one with the same composed grace, never lingering, never drawing attention to herself, and as the moments passed, it became clear that she was not avoiding the spotlight, she simply did not need it. Victor watched this with a growing clarity, realizing that what had captivated the room was not just her voice, but her absence of need for validation, something he had never fully understood until now. "Will you stay?" he asked after a moment, the question simple, but carrying an unspoken curiosity. Emily glanced briefly toward the stage, then back at him. "For a little while," she answered, her tone neutral, neither eager nor reluctant, just present. Victor nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further, because for once, he understood that not every moment needed to be extended, not every silence needed to be filled, and as he stepped back slightly, giving her space, the room continued to adjust around them, not returning to what it had been, but moving forward into something quieter, something more thoughtful. And though the night would go on, though the lights would dim and the conversations would eventually fade, there was a shift that would not reverse, a subtle change in how people looked at one another, how quickly they judged, how easily they assumed. And in that quiet corner of the ballroom, where a simple woman had once stood unnoticed, a new understanding remained, steady and unspoken, that true presence does not demand attention, it reveals itself when it matters most, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. The evening continued, but it no longer felt like the same event that had begun hours earlier. The polished conversations, the effortless laughter, the carefully curated impressions, all of it had softened, replaced by something more grounded, more real. And at the center of that quiet transformation, Emily Carter remained exactly where she had chosen to be, near the edge of the room, not hidden, but not seeking to be seen, speaking occasionally with those who approached her, each exchange brief, sincere, untouched by performance. While across the ballroom, Victor Langford found himself in unfamiliar territory, not commanding attention, but observing it, noticing how it moved differently now, how it no longer followed the loudest voice, but settled where it felt something genuine. He stood beside a table for a moment, watching as a small group of guests spoke quietly among themselves, their earlier excitement replaced by thoughtful reflection. One of them shook his head slightly and said, "I cannot believe we almost laughed," and the others nodded, not defensively, but in agreement, acknowledging something they had not seen in themselves until it was revealed. Victor exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization not heavy, but undeniable. He turned his gaze back toward Emily, who was now speaking softly with one of the musicians, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, and in that moment, he understood that what had happened on that stage had not elevated her, it had revealed her, and perhaps more importantly, it had revealed everyone else. He took a few steps forward, not with urgency, but with intention, stopping once again within a respectful distance, not to interrupt, but to be present. The musician finished speaking and stepped away with a nod, leaving the space between them open once more. "You know," Victor said quietly, his voice carrying none of the sharpness it once had, "I built my entire career on moments like that." Emily looked at him. Listening, not reacting, finding people, putting them in the spotlight, turning unpredictability into entertainment. He continued, his words measured, reflective. "I always thought I was creating something memorable." He paused briefly, his gaze lowering for just a moment before returning to hers. "But tonight, I realized I was only controlling what people saw, not what was real." The admission lingered. Not dramatic, not forced, simply honest. Emily considered his words for a moment, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. "Control can shape a moment," she said gently, "but it cannot define its meaning." Victor let out a quiet breath, something close to acceptance settling in. He nodded once, slowly, as if the simplicity of her words had clarified something he had been unable to articulate for years. Around them, the room continued to move, but the energy remained different. Conversations carried more intention, laughter came softer, more genuine, and even. The staff moved with a subtle shift, no longer blending into the background as easily, as if their presence, too, had been acknowledged in a way that could not be undone. A woman approached Emily cautiously, holding a small program booklet from the event. "Would you mind signing this?" she asked, her tone respectful, almost hesitant, as if unsure whether it was appropriate. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then accepted it with a small nod, writing her name simply, without flourish, without hesitation, returning it with the same quiet composure she had carried all night. The woman thanked her softly and stepped away, holding the booklet as if it meant more than just ink on paper. Victor observed this, not with curiosity, but with understanding, realizing that the moment had extended far beyond the stage, that its impact was no longer confined to a performance, but had become something personal for everyone who had witnessed it. "Will you go back to the way things were?" he asked after a moment, the question quiet, but sincere. Emily glanced briefly toward the service entrance, then back at him, her expression steady. "Things do not go back," she said, her voice calm. "They move forward." Victor absorbed that, his lips pressing together slightly before relaxing again. He nodded once more, not in agreement alone, but in acknowledgement of something larger than either of them. And as the night continued to unfold, with music playing softly and conversations flowing in a new rhythm, it became clear that what had happened would not fade with the lights. It would remain, not as a spectacle, but as a shift, subtle yet lasting. And in that quiet understanding, carried in the glances, the words, the silences between them, the room held on to something it had not expected to find, a reminder that true value does not need to be announced. It reveals itself when the moment demands it. And once revealed, it quietly changes everything that follows. The night began to settle into its final hours, but the atmosphere refused to return to its original shape, as if something invisible had rewritten the rules of the room. The chandeliers still glowed with the same golden light, the music still flowed softly through the air, yet every interaction now carried a quiet awareness that had not been there before. And at the edge of it all, Emily Carter stood once more near the service entrance, not retreating, but simply existing in the space she had always occupied. Only now the space had changed around her. People no longer passed by without notice, they paused, even if only for a second, their eyes reflecting recognition, respect, and something deeper, something that lingered beyond the moment. Victor Langford remained across the room, watching not with the calculating gaze he once relied on, but with a stillness that suggested understanding. He had spent years mastering the art of shaping perception, but tonight had shown him something far more enduring, that truth does not need to be shaped, it reveals itself when it is ready. and when it does, it leaves no room for control. He walked slowly toward the stage one last time, not to reclaim it, but to close the evening in a way that felt honest. He stepped under the light, the same place where the night had shifted, and for a moment, he said nothing, allowing the room to quiet naturally. Not through command, but through presence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried without performance, steady and clear. "Tonight was supposed to be about entertainment," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the audience, "but I think it became something else." A soft murmur moved through the crowd, not disagreement, but recognition. He continued, "We came here expecting to watch something, but instead, we were reminded of something." His words were simple, but they landed differently now. Shaped not by intention, but by experience. He did not elaborate, he did not need to, because the room already understood, the meaning had already been felt, not explained. He lowered the microphone slightly, then added quietly, "And sometimes, that matters more." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with the shared understanding that had grown throughout the night. Victor stepped back, not waiting for applause, not seeking it, and this time, when the room responded, it was not for him alone, but for what had been revealed. The applause rose again, not as loud as before, but deeper, more grounded, more sincere, and as it did, Victor turned his gaze toward the edge of the room, where Emily still stood, unchanged, untouched by the need to be at the center, and yet unmistakably the center of what mattered. She met his gaze briefly, not with acknowledgement of victory, but with quiet understanding, as if the moment belonged to neither of them alone, but to everyone who had witnessed it. And then, without drawing attention, without shifting the energy that had settled so naturally, she stepped back, disappearing once more behind the velvet curtain, returning to the place where she had begun, but not in the same way, because now the room knew, and that knowledge could not be undone. The music resumed, conversations slowly picked up again, but they carried something different now, a subtle shift in tone, in awareness, in how people looked at one another, as if each person had been reminded, in their own way, to look a little deeper, to listen a little longer, to hesitate before judging what they did not yet understand. Victor remained on the stage for a moment longer, the microphone lowered at his side, his role no longer defined by control, but by recognition. And as the evening finally began to close, with guests preparing to leave and the lights dimming just slightly, there was one thing that lingered beyond the music, beyond the conversations, beyond the polished surface of the event itself, a quiet truth that had revealed itself without force, without demand, and yet had changed everything it touched. That dignity does not announce itself, it waits, patiently, until the moment comes when it can no longer be ignored. And when that moment arrives, it does not need to speak loudly, because the silence it creates says everything. And that night, in a room built on appearances, everyone remembered what it looks like when something real finally takes its place.